Right, it is time to begin. Morning, everyone. Um, let's start with the word of prayer, and then we'll get into our class. Our Father in heaven, we come before your throne today, and just thank you for bringing us together, and just thank you for Dawn's safe return home. Continue to be with his mother as she's in rehab, and pray that she might be able to get back to full health. And Father, we know that there's a number of people that are sick or struggling for whatever reason, and just pray that you could be with them as well. Father, help us to clear our minds of any cares and concerns that we might have in the struggles of this world, and just help us to be attentive to what we have to learn from your word. We again thank you for your word, God, and the insight it provides us into your will. Help us, as our brother James teaches us, to always be doers of your word and not just hearers. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Genesis chapter 21. That's where we're going to spend our time today. Here in Genesis chapter 21, the author of Genesis finally reaches one of the major points that he's been working towards for several chapters in Genesis. And that major point is the birth of the son that God had promised to Abraham and Sarah. Now, what brings the author to this point is another case in chapter 20, which follows the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, an account of Lot's daughters engaging in relations with him, resulting in two sons being born by each of Lot's daughters. After all that, Abraham comes into contact with an individual named Abimelech, and again, there was a case of deception on the part of Abraham, where Abraham had led Abimelech to believe that Sarah was his sister, similar to what we've studied before, and that was in an effort to protect himself. But what we also learn in the story of chapter 20 is that God protected Sarah, and the reason for that was because of his plan to keep his promise to Abraham and Sarah in giving them a son. So those are the things that set a context for us of what we read in verse 1 of chapter 21, where it is written, "Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised." Now again, what has God promised to Sarah? A son. So verse 1 carries with it the idea that after the events described up to this point, God visited Sarah and finally does what he'd promised he would do, give her a son. So this recalls previous instances where that promise keeps coming up, that there would come a time when when God would keep his promise to Sarah, and she would give birth to a son. As a result, in verse 2, Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Now, building on verse 1, this has the sense that since God visited and kept his promise to Sarah, Sarah conceived, she gave birth to a son, and the text reminds us that it was at a very old age of Abraham and Sarah that God said this would occur. Now, with that being true, another detail that comes out in the text, that this would be at an appointed time. God had a specific time in mind at which this would happen. Now, again, this recalls previous chapters in Genesis. We read in Genesis 17, verse 21, chapter 18, verse 10, chapter 18, verse 14, that God had communicated these things and to Abraham and Sarah, and this was 1 year. In those passages I just mentioned, it would be 1 year from those points that Sarah would conceive and give birth to her son. Questions or comments on verses 1 and 2 before we look at verse 3? Okay. So, going on into verse 3, the author continues by recording that Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Now, can anyone remind me why the name Isaac is given to this son? Okay, there was something about the promise. What else is significant about the name Isaac? Okay, that's what the name Isaac means. He laughs. So, that in mind, why is that name chosen? Both of them laughed. Yeah. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Yeah, before this point, exactly. Before this point, both Abraham and Sarah laughed at the fact that God would give them a son, at their very old age. But what's also going on in this verse is that Abraham is following God's command. It was God who commanded that this boy need be named Isaac. So Abraham is following this command. And that is a direct result of the fact that both Abraham and Sarah had laughed at the fact. Now, since all that's true, um, well, that's why Abraham and Isaac, or why Isaac received the name that he did. But with all these things being true, what the author records in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 21 again sets the stage for the things that are recorded concerning Isaac in verses 4 through 13. Now, in verses 4 through 13, what we find are a few points that deal with how the birth of Isaac was a turning point. It was a turning point in the lives of Abraham and Sarah. And the reason it was a turning point is because certain things happened in the lives of these two individuals. I feel my mic kind of going in and out. Yeah, there. Okay. I just felt like a tapping. Okay, if it's okay with you guys. Okay, can you hear me now? All right. I'll move it away from my mouth. It's just, I try to keep it loud enough because if I move it away from my mouth, it's when it goes in and out. All right. Is that okay on your end, Jeremiah? Okay. All right, so again, we're looking at a few points in the text of verses 4 through 13 where we see that the birth of Isaac resulted in things in the lives of Abraham and Sarah. Now, verses 4 through 7, we'll see once again that the birth of Isaac caused laughter. We're going to look at that again. In verse 8, it brought celebration. And finally, in verses 9 through 13, there was once again a change in Sarah's relationship with Hagar. Now, with that in mind, the application of these things in our lives is that in our own lives, God will bring turning points. Things will happen in our lives that bring life-changing results. So with that in mind, we'll read verses 4 through 13, and then we'll look at the points. It says again in Genesis 21, beginning in verse 4, Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Therefore she said to Abraham, Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. But God said to Abraham, Do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. And of the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. So we'll pause there. So, again, the first point made about the results of the birth of Isaac is that it caused laughter. Now, what's the first thing Abraham does after Isaac is born there in verse 4? Circumcision at 8 days old. Now, why does he do this? It was a command. This was something that was commanded of Abraham. That's Genesis 17, verse 12. In that verse, God commanded Abraham, every male that is born into your household or brought into your household is to be circumcised at 8 days old if there was a natural birth. So again, this is another example of Abraham's faithfulness to God. Then going on into verse 5, we're again given the age of Abraham. He was 100 years old. Now this also recalls chapter 17. In verse 17 of that chapter, the age of Abraham is recorded. He's 99. Chapter 17, 1 year later, he's now 100 years old. But also from that same verse, that is where Abraham laughed at the fact that he and Sarah would receive a child at such an old age. Questions or comments on verses 4 or 5? Okay. So, because of verses 4 and 5, and verse 6, the author of Genesis records a statement from Sarah. She says, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Now, what's being said in this verse? What's Sarah referring to? Say that again, Dean. Right. So this is going back to what has already been discussed, that it's brought laughter into her life. She's just still kind of amazed that God could bring this child at such an old age. But at this point in the story, Dawn alluded to this earlier, this laughter now at this point, it's more laughter of celebration than doubt. Andrew? Okay. God has brought me laughter. Right. So it's the same idea that God has brought laughter into her life. But at this point, God has fulfilled his promise. Any doubt is removed. And now it's a laughter of celebration. I mean, sometimes people laugh because they're so happy about something. And that what seems to be what's going on here. And that's why she says, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Any other questions or comments on that? Okay. So, because of what has been said in verse 6, there's a question, a rhetorical question recorded in verse 7, followed by a statement. She says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age? Now, what do you hear Sarah saying here? What's the point of this question? The amazement. It's the amazement being expressed here. Anybody on the outside looking at Abraham and Sarah without children at their ages would have said, there's no way. There's no way this woman's going to have a child. But what happened? She did. That's exactly what Sarah expresses. Yet it has happened. I have borne him a son in his old age. I've given a son to Abraham. So yes, this is amazement. So the question presented here that initially, Sandy, go ahead. It's possible. The text doesn't tell us for sure, but it's possible. I mean, women who, at this time, women who didn't have children at a certain point in their lives would have been looked down upon, would have been seen as cursed. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, she might have been carrying some guilt up to this point. You also see the example of Hannah in 1 Samuel. She'd been barren, and the other woman in that story made fun of her, basically. And so, in this culture, a woman probably would have seen themselves as cursed, as guilty of maybe having sinned against God, simply because they did not give birth to a child. Um, but that's a good question, Sandy. Anything else on verse 7? That's also true. The fact that it was a son that would have been given a male heir to the father's possessions. Anything else on verse 7? Okay. So when we put verses 4 through 7 together, what we see from these verses concerning the birth of Isaac is that it caused laughter. But again, this is a laughter of celebration at this point. It's a laughter of joy. Elaine, did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. So at the point that Isaac was born, all that doubt is removed, and their doubt is turned to joy. Joy at the fact that God was able to give them a son even at their very old age. Now that brings us into verse 8. The birth of Isaac caused celebration. Now the first part of this verse, a very simple fact, the child grew and was weaned. Very brief statement, but simply saying that over time Isaac grew up. He was weaned from his mother. Now at this time, the weaning of a child would not take place until they were 2 to 3 years of age. And so if Isaac was 2 to 3 years of age at the time of his weaning, then between verses 7 and 8, there's 2 to 3 years that have passed. Again, you've heard me say before that from one chapter of the Bible, or even from one verse to the next, there's times of spans of time that could have been passed. Could have been. Maybe. But yeah, whatever the case, the text says he made a great feast. Now, possibly, we don't know why, but possibly because he's transitioned from off that weaning, but we don't know. Now, but it says he made a great feast. Now, when we think of a feast, what do we think of? Lots of food and lots of people. We might call it a banquet. So just a lot of celebration. This is recently on my mind, so I'll just use this as an illustration. But the reception at Kelsey's wedding, I had the privilege of attending. Lots of food, lots of people, a lot of celebration going on. So, very simple point being made in this verse about the birth of Isaac. It brought celebration. The birth of a child is always cause for celebration in whatever way. But this did not take place until Isaac was weaned, which the text tells us. Anything else on verse 8? Okay. So this brings us into verses 9 through 13. We again see the relationship change between Sarah and Hagar. Now the first point that's made there in verse 9 is that Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, who she had borne to Abraham. And the NASB uses the word mocking. Does anyone have a different word at the end of verse 9? What word was that, Dean? Scoffing? Okay. So mocking or scoffing. Now this is already, in this verse, the author of Genesis continues to recall what has already been said concerning the story of Abraham and Sarah. Now, what did we learn previously about the relationship between Sarah and Hagar after the birth of Ishmael? It was strained. Now, what did Sarah do to Hagar? How was it strained? She was mean to her. So that's beginning to come up again. Now, so this is recalling what we read about in Genesis 16. Sarah, then known as Sarai, and Hagar. Sarai had proposed to Abraham, God has promised me this son. You have relations with Hagar, take her as your wife, and Ishmael is born, and then, yes, Hagar is treated harshly. But in this context, Sarah sees Hagar's son mocking or scoffing. Now, the word mocking or scoffing, if that's what you have, it's a word that can mean also playing or laughing. It's a difficult word. Now, if she sees his son playing or laughing, we don't know exactly what's going on. But context seems to indicate that what Ishmael was doing was something that was offensive to Sarah in whatever way. Now, the fact that this may have been harmful behavior is also evidenced in the text of Galatians 4, verse 29. We're not going to go there, but in that verse, the Apostle Paul is speaking of this very instance. And he says Ishmael has been basically persecuting Isaac, doing something toward Isaac. Now, with Galatians 4, verse 29 in mind, what seems to be going on here is that Ishmael is doing something to Isaac. The text does not specify what's going on. Questions or comments on that? It was not a very good idea on his part. Yeah, absolutely. We would just have to go back and find out how much time has passed between the birth of Ishmael and Isaac, but I don't have that information in front of me. Um, they're several years apart, but again, I don't have the specific number. Um, but he's 2 to 3 years old. Ishmael would have been significantly older. Yeah, Isaac would have been 2 to 3 years old, but how much older Ishmael would have been, I'm not sure. Possibly. Possibly. So it is hurtful. So, right. So we're getting some insight here. And again, that all comes from Galatians 4, verse 29. Something wrong is going on here. And that's possibly why the words mocking or scoffing are used in the English from that Hebrew word, which can mean playing or laughing. So, with all that in mind, what does Sarah do in verse 10? Okay. So, that's what Sarah does. She says to Abraham, get her out of here. I don't want her or her son. And again, for what reason, according to verse 10? What does Sarah know? Go ahead, Dean. They want him hanging around with Isaac, but what's more, he, he's not going to be an heir. She refuses to have him as an heir. So that's a point that comes up. Is Ishmael was the firstborn of Abraham, strictly speaking. So normally Ishmael would bear that title of heir. Now that gives us, if that idea is there, that could give us some insight into verse 9 as to why Ishmael would be mocking or scoffing at Isaac. He might believe himself to be the heir. But Sarah sees this going on, and she says, Abraham, I want him out. I want he and his mother out of here. Yeah, we see that in the Cain and Abel story. So, yeah. Whether or not that would have happened here, we can't know for sure, but still, something wrong is going on. It could have been one of Sarah's fears. So, These are a lot of possibilities. Now, also what Sarah is asking Abraham to do here, it's something that was already accomplished once in chapter 16. Hagar had run away once, but God, the angel of the Lord in that chapter, told her to come back. But so here Sarah's asking Abraham, do the same thing, get her out of here. But in chapter 16, it was Sarah that drove her out. Here Sarah's asking Abraham to drive her out. So there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some differences. Any other questions or comments on verse 10? As a slave woman. Right. The NASB uses the word maid, but some translations do use slave woman because this does come from the word for slave in the female form. Anything else on verse 10? Okay. Now, how does Abraham respond to this in verse 11? It was displeasing to him. The NASB uses the words distressed. It distressed Abraham greatly. Why? According to this verse. Probably so. It may not be Sarah's son that she gave birth to, but it's still Abraham's son. So this bothers him. He's distressed greatly, the text says. So he's not sure what to do because this is his son. Sarah's made this request, but Abraham's in his own mind is thinking, this is my son. I don't want to do this. Questions or comments on verse 11? Okay. So verse 12, God enters the scene. What does he say? Say, do not let this be displeasing in your sight. What else? Do what your wife asked, and he'll take care of it. Now, what's Isaac's role in this situation, the statement? What's the text say? Yeah, that Isaac's the promised son. So it's through Isaac that Abraham's descendants would come. We're going to talk about Ishmael here in the next verse, but yeah, and that's what's right, and he was the promised son. So yeah. Right. So God says to Abraham, do what she asks. Do what your wife wants you to do, Abraham, because Isaac is the one that God's promise would come true through. So, and God is telling Abraham, set your mind at ease. Don't be bothered with this, because it's through Isaac that these promised descendants would come. Now, God has made the promise to Abraham, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation, but it'll be through Isaac that this great nation of Abraham would come. So part of Abraham's difficulty, what this tells us, concerned the fact he might have been asking himself, well, is it Ishmael or Isaac that God's going to keep his promise? So God makes this statement. This answers Abraham's questions, saying it's through Isaac that I'm going to keep my promise to you, Abraham. Yeah. Probably so, just based on context. Right. That's true. So now God is making it clear, and that's why he tells Abraham, do what your wife asked. But Abraham might still be experiencing a little bit of difficulty with this. So what does God say in verse 13? And and Ishmael will also be the father of a nation. So there's two things going on in verses 12 and 13. First, verse 12, it's through Isaac that God's going to keep his promise, but he's also telling Abraham, I'm still going to take care of your other son, Ishmael. And here's how. He's also going to make a great nation out of Ishmael. Ishmael's not going to get hurt. There's nothing bad that's going to happen to him. He's still going to be taken care of. So Isaac and Ishmael both have futures ahead of them. So there's a dual promise being made here. Questions or comments on verse 13? Okay. So when we put verses 9 through 13 together, the point we should see here concerning the birth of Isaac is that the birth of Isaac caused Sarah to turn against Hagar. Now in these verses, the author of Genesis is showing that the birth of Isaac continued to strain the relationship between Sarah and Hagar. Now, as the context seems to suggest, as well as Galatians 4 verse 29, the source of this difficulty was because of Ishmael's treatment of Isaac, whatever that was. So Sarah, once again, turns against Hagar, asks Abraham to get rid of her and her son. And ultimately, Abraham agrees to that because of God's reaffirmation of his promise that through Isaac, Abraham would receive a long line of descendants, but Ishmael would also be taken care of. He'd become a great nation. So, this is at least part of the story of the birth of Isaac. And the point we should be left with from all these verses is that it was a turning point in the lives of Abraham and Sarah. It was a turning point because it brought laughter, it caused celebration, and it also once again caused a change in relationship between Sarah and Hagar. So again, the application is God will bring turning points into our lives, things that change our lives in one way or another. It could be a marriage, the birth of a child, a new job, new relationship, just something that changes the course of your life. But what we should also remember in those things is that these turning points are part of his greater plan and serve for the benefit of those who love him and are seeking to obey him. Any other questions or comments? Andrew, go ahead. Okay. And he's 100 now, so that makes Ishmael 14 years old. Yeah, when Isaac is born. So he's probably about 17 by the time we reach that closing part when Sarah asked Abraham to drive him out. So again, it's a very significant age difference. Thank you for looking that up. Anything else? Okay. Dawn, will you close us in prayer?